Now this is one of the best, strongest, and fastest Lightning Spear Sorcerer build in Season 5. With this build you can easily clear tier 8 Infernal Hoards and melt Uber Lilith. This build does tons of damage and can destroy any Uber bosses in seconds. And I highly recommend you to watch this video from the beginning to the end to see how everything synergizes. So let's check this out. So first I'm going to show you clearing a tier 8 Infernal Horde solo. I can easily clear tier 8 Infernal Hordes and get tons of materials. This build is so strong that it can easily destroy huge groups of enemies and quickly shred bosses. This build also has a lot of crowd control and can stagger bosses very quickly. Now you'll need to fully masterwork your gear in order to easily clear the highest level content in the game. Now a key item for this build is a unique amulet, the Fractured Winterglass, to easily cast tons of conjuration skills on the field. And with this build our main source of damage is coming from a legendary aspect, the aspect of Splintering Energy, which will do tons of damage to enemies with the Lightning Spear conjuration skill, and the reason we need to build a lot of critical strike damage. And with this build you can always have your ultimate skill Unstable Currents active all the time. Now I'm going to show you a build with high survivability and with Ubers, but you don't need any Ubers to do the hardest content in the game. What's more important than Ubers is masterworking your gear to greatly increase your damage and survivability. Now I'm going to showcase the high survivability build so you can easily clear tier 8 Infernal Hordes, but in the D4 build planner linked in the description below, I'll share the survivability build, a damage focused build for clearing high tier pits, and a build without Uber uniques, and I'll cover everything in more details in their dedicated sections. Okay, so next for the skills. Now the core skill for this build is Frozen Orb, and this skill will shoot an orb that chills and damages enemies. Now we need to pair this skill with the unique amulet, the Fractured Winterglass, to spawn as many conjuration skills as possible. The idea is to spawn as much Lightning Spear conjurations because Lightning Spear is our main source of damage. The next skill I'm using is the ultimate skill Unstable Currents, and when this skill is active you'll cast tons of shock skills when you cast the shock skill, and we can easily cast tons of Lightning Spears because this build has a lot of cooldown reduction. And by building a lot of lucky hit chance and a legendary aspect, the aspect of the Orange Herald, you can have the ultimate skill active all the time. The next skill I'm using is Lightning Spear, and this skill will conjure a spear of lightning that seeks out and damages enemies. When Lightning Spear critically strikes an enemy, it will apply vulnerable and stun the enemy. Now this is our main damage dealing skill, and the damage is only coming from a legendary aspect, the aspect of Splintering Energy, and not the skill itself. And this skill will easily destroy huge groups of enemies and melt bosses. The next skill I'm using is Ice Armor, and this skill is a really strong barrier skill, really good for survivability. And since this build has so much cooldown reduction, you can have Ice Armor active all the time. The next skill I'm using is Flame Shield, and this is a barrier skill that will make you completely immune to damage and burning surrounding enemies. Now I mainly use this skill to break out of crowd control effects because in the highest tier Infernal Hordes there will be a lot of enemies that can crowd control you. And the last skill I'm using is Teleport, and this is the best and fastest movement skill in the game. This skill will also make you unstoppable, allowing you to break out of crowd control effects, which is really important in the highest tier Infernal Hordes. Okay, so next for the enchantments. Now the first enchantment I'm using is the Firebolt enchantment, and this enchantment will apply burning damage to our skills, and allowing our skills to do burning damage will pair with our gear and some other skills on the skill tree to greatly increase our damage. The next enchantment I'm using is the Ice Blades enchantment, and with this enchantment you'll spawn an Ice Blade on a random enemy for every 40 seconds in cooldown you spend. And since we are using almost all cooldown skills, you can have tons of Ice Blades on the field. Now Ice Blades is a conjuration skill that will pair with our other skills and gear to greatly increase our damage, and Ice Blades will also reduce the cooldown of your other skills when Ice Blades hits a vulnerable enemy, making this skill really strong. Okay, so next for the skill tree. Now I'm going to showcase the survivability build so you can easily clear tier 8 Infernal Hordes. But if you plan to push high tier pits, or if you don't have any Uber uniques, the skill tree will be slightly different. So I will have different skill tree layouts in the D4 build planner in the description below, depending on your situation. So starting with the basic skills, I put 2 points into Firebolt, and this is just for the Firebolt enchantment to apply burning damage to our skills. And doing burning damage will pair with our gear and some other skills on the skill tree to greatly increase our damage. Next for the core skills, I put 1 point into Charge Bolts, a point into Enhanced Charge Bolts, and a point into Destructive Charge Bolts. Now we are not actually using Charge Bolts, but we will cast Charge Bolts when we use our ultimate skill Unstable Currents. And with this build you can have Unstable Currents active all the time. So when Charge Bolts hits an enemy, it will reduce the enemy's damage, making this skill really good for survivability. And then I put 2 points into Potent Warding. Now this build already has capped out resistance, but Potent Warding will increase our maximum resistance, which is really really good for survivability. Now, since I am equipping the Shaco that gives plus 4 ranks to all skills, I don't need to put any points into Frozen Orb and can save a skill point here. But if you don't have the Shaco, you do want to put 1 point into Frozen Orb. Next, for the defensive skills, I put 1 point into Flame Shield, a point into Enhanced Flame Shield, and a point into Mystical Flame Shield. And this is a barrier skill that will make you completely immune to damage and burning surrounding enemies. Now, this skill will be used to mainly break out of crowd control effects, because in the highest tier Infernal Hoards, there will be a lot of enemies that can crowd control you. And Flame Shield will stun surrounding enemies, which is really good for crowd control and quickly staggering bosses. Next, I put 1 point into Teleport, a point into Enhanced Teleport, and a point into Shimmering Teleport. And this is the best and fastest movement skill in the game. This skill will also make you unstoppable, allowing you to break out of crowd control effects. Next, I put 1 point into Ice Armor, a point into Enhanced Ice Armor, and a point into Mystical Ice Armor. And this skill is a really strong barrier skill, good for survivability. And because this build has tons of cooldown reduction, you can have Ice Armor active all the time. Ice Armor will also greatly increase your damage to frozen enemies or bosses that are staggered. Now, I do want to mention that if you don't have a lot of cooldown reduction, then you would want to take Shimmering Ice Armor instead to quickly reduce Ice Armor's cooldown to always have it active. It's important to always have Ice Armor active all the time so you can survive the hardest content in the game. Next, I put 1 point into Elemental Entombment, and this skill will give you a chance to reset one of your defensive skills when one of your skills critically strikes an enemy. And then I put 3 points into Glass Cannon, and this skill will greatly increase your damage, but in return you will take more damage. Next, for the Conjuration skills, I put 1 point into Ice Blades, a point into Enhanced Ice Blades, and a point into Summoned Ice Blades. And this skill is used for the Ice Blades enchantment, and with this enchantment you'll spawn an Ice Blade on a random enemy for every 40 seconds in cooldown you spend. And since we're using almost all cooldown skills, you can have tons of Ice Blades on the field. Now, Ice Blades is a Conjuration skill that will pair with our other skills and gear to greatly increase our damage. And Ice Blades will also reduce the cooldown of our other skills when Ice Blades hits a vulnerable enemy. Next, I put 1 point into Lightning Spear, a point into Enhanced Lightning Spear, and a point into Invoked Lightning Spear. And this skill will conjure a spear of lightning that seeks out and damages enemies. When Lightning Spear critically strikes an enemy, it will apply vulnerable and stun the enemy. Now, this is our main damage dealing skill, and the damage is only coming from a legendary aspect, the aspect of Splintering Energy, and not the skill itself. So that's why we only put 1 point into Lightning Spear. And this skill will easily destroy huge groups of enemies and melt bosses. And next, I put 3 points into Conjuration Mastery, and this skill will increase your damage, movement speed, and mana regeneration for each active conjuration. And since this build summons a lot of conjuration skills, this skill will greatly increase your damage. And next, I put 3 points into Precision Magic, and this will greatly increase your lucky hit chance. And lucky hit chance is important for this build. We need lucky hit chance to apply crowd control effects to enemies, to quickly stagger bosses, and to reduce the cooldown of the ultimate skill. And then I put 1 point into Align the Elements, 3 points into Mana Shield, and 3 points into Protection. And these skills are really good for defense and survivability. Next, for the Mastery skills, I put 1 point into Inner Flames and 3 points into Devouring Blaze. And this skill will greatly increase your critical strike damage against burning enemies. And next, I put 3 points into Icy Veil, and this skill will increase the duration of our barrier skills, allowing us to have Ice Armor active all the time. Next, for the ultimate skills, I put 1 point into Unstable Currents and a point into Prime Unstable Currents. And when this skill is active, you will cast tons of shock skills when you cast the shock skill. And we can easily cast tons of Lightning Spears because this build has tons of cooldown reduction. And by building a lot of lucky hit chance and a legendary aspect, the aspect of the Orange Herald, you can have this ultimate skill active all the time. Next, I put 1 point into Coursing Currents and 3 points into Electrocution. And with this skill, enemies will do less damage to you when you critically strike them with your shock skills. And then I put 1 point into Convulsion, and this skill will give your shock skills a chance to stun enemies, which is really good for crowd control. And next, I put 1 point into Permafrost and 3 points into Horror Frost, and this skill will greatly increase your damage to chilled or frozen enemies or bosses when they are staggered. And last but not least, for the key passive, I put a point into Virus Mastery, and this states when you critically strike an enemy with a shock skill, you become charged and take 25% less damage for 5 seconds. While charged, critical strikes have a 10% chance to cause the damage to arc as lightning damage to another nearby enemy, or if there are no other targets, you hit the target again for 250% of the damage. And this key passive will greatly increase your defense and survivability whenever you critically strike an enemy with your shock skill. And you also have a chance to do tons of lightning damage to groups of enemies when you critically strike them with your shock skill. Okay, so that's the full skill tree layout for the survivability build to easily destroy huge groups of enemies and shred bosses while having tons of survivability to easily clear tier 8 Infernal Hoards. And depending on your situation, I'll have the different skill tree layouts in a D4 build planner in the description below. Okay, so next for the gear. Now, since this is an endgame build, ideally you would want to use Uber Uniques with this build. However, I also provided alternate gear options if you don't have access to Uber Uniques. It's important to note that you don't need Uber Uniques to tackle the hardest content in the game, as masterworking is more crucial for significantly boosting your stats and damage. Additionally, I've created 3 different layouts in the D4 build planner linked in the description below. One for survivability to easily clear tier 8 Infernal Hoards, one for damage dealing for doing high tier pits, and one with no Uber Uniques. And these different builds will have different gear layouts and different skills on the skill tree. So starting with the helmet, I'm using the Uber Unique helmet, the Shaco. And this Uber Unique helmet is one of the best helmets in the game because it has maximum life, armor, and cooldown reduction. And the unique aspect states gain 20% damage reduction. In addition, gain +4 ranks to all skills. And this unique aspect is really good for survivability and getting plus ranks to all our skills. So we can save a skill point on the skill tree. Okay, so next for the chest piece, I'm using the Teriel's Might Uber Unique chest piece. And this chest piece is really strong for survivability. This chest piece will give you movement speed, increase your maximum resistance, and gives you tons of damage reduction. And the unique aspect states your skills unleash a divine barrage, dealing 5,736 damage. Now the unique aspect is good for clearing trash enemies, but the main reason we are using this chest piece is for the stats for gaining tons of survivability. Next for the gloves, I'm using the unique gloves, the Fist of Fate. And these gloves will give you attack speed, critical strike chance, lucky hit chance, and a chance to apply a random crowd control effect to an enemy. And the unique aspect states your attacks randomly deal 1% to 300% of their normal damage. Now these gloves are really strong to easily crowd control enemies and stagger bosses. These gloves will also greatly increase your lucky hit chance, which is important for this build. Next for the pants, I have intelligence, maximum life, and dodge chance. But if you go with the more damage dealing build and equip the raiment of the infinite, you do want to replace the dodge chance with armor. And for the tempering stats, I have flame shield duration and lightning spear lucky hit chance. And the legendary aspect states lucky hit up to a 10% chance to reduce the cooldown of your ultimate skill by 2 seconds, can only happen once per skill cast. And this legendary aspect is important to have your ultimate skill unstable currents active all the time, and the reason we need to build lucky hit chance with this build. Next for the boots, I'm using the unique boots, the Esu's Heirloom. And with these boots you will greatly increase your movement speed, and it has critical strike damage. And critical strike damage is important for this build to greatly increase the lightning spear's damage. And the unique aspect states your critical strike chance is increased by 39% of your movement speed bonus. So these unique boots will greatly increase your critical strike chance depending on your movement speed. And if you check out the implicit stat, these unique boots will greatly increase your movement speed every time you evade. So you want to evade as much as possible to greatly increase your critical strike chance. Next for the weapon, I'm using a two-handed staff. And for the stats, I have intelligence, max life, and critical strike damage. And for the tempering, I have critical strike damage and a chance for a second lightning spear when cast. And you want the tempering stats, chance for a second lightning spear when cast, as close to 100%. So you can have tons of lightning spears on the field. And for the legendary aspect, it states critical hits with lightning spear cause lightning to arc from it, dealing 4,853 damage to its target and up to 5 other enemies. This damage is increased by your critical strike damage bonus. So this legendary aspect is our main source of damage, and the reason we need to build as much critical strike damage as possible, because critical strike damage will greatly increase this legendary aspect's damage. Next for the amulet, I'm using the unique amulet, the Fractured Winter Glass, and this is a key item for this build. This unique amulet has non-physical damage, a chance for frozen orb projectiles to cast twice, conjuration cooldowns are reduced by 0.6 seconds when a frozen orb explodes, and plus ranks to conjuration mastery. So this unique amulet will greatly reduce your conjuration's cooldown every time a frozen orb explodes, allowing you to spam lightning spears all the time. And the unique aspect states casting frozen orb has a 65% chance to spawn a random conjuration when it explodes. Lucky hit, your conjurations have up to a 90% chance to launch a frozen orb at nearby enemies. So with this unique aspect, your frozen orb will spawn conjurations, and your conjurations have a chance to launch frozen orbs, allowing you to have tons of conjurations on the field. Next for the rings. Now for the first ring, I have attack speed, critical strike chance, and critical strike damage. And for the tempering, I have lightning spear cooldown reduction and critical strike damage. And the legendary aspect states frozen orb explodes 2 additional times at its destination for 60% of its damage. And this legendary aspect is important because pairing this legendary aspect with the unique amulet, the Fractured Winter Glass, we will greatly reduce the cooldown of your conjuration skills. And for the second ring, I'm using the unique ring, the Talrash's ring. And this ring has lucky hit chance, non-physical damage, and cooldown reduction. And the unique aspect states for each type of elemental damage you deal, gain 20% increased damage for 4 seconds, up to 80%. Dealing elemental damage refreshes all bonuses. So this unique ring will greatly increase your damage. Now I do want to mention that if you're trying to push the highest tier pits, you do want to have more damage over survivability to defeat the pit bosses before time runs out. So you do want to equip the unique chest piece, the Raiment of the Infinite, over Tyrael's Might. The reason why is the Raiment of the Infinite gives you plus ranks to Glass Cannon, which will greatly increase your damage, but you will lose a lot of elemental resistance if you equip the Raiment of the Infinite over Tyrael's Might. So you do want to get the armor stat on your pants and use elemental resistant gems on your jewelry to cap out all your defensive stats. Okay, so really quickly for the gems. Now for the armor pieces, I'm using topaz gems to increase my intelligence stats, and increasing your intelligence will greatly increase your damage. But I do want to mention that if you're having trouble surviving, you can use ruby gems on your armor pieces to increase your maximum life. And for the weapon, I'm using sapphire gems to greatly increase my critical strike damage. And for the jewelry, you want to use skull gems to increase your armor. And if you check out my stats, my armor is at 10,235, which is above the armor cap at 9,230. And if you check out my resistance, all my resistance is capped out. And if you check out my critical strike chance, my critical strike chance is at 61.3%. But when I evade, my critical strike chance does increase to 79.7%. So you want to evade all the time to greatly increase your critical strike chance. Okay, so I did showcase the survivability build layout to easily clear tier 8 Infernal Hoards, but just make sure to masterwork your gear as it's crucial for significantly boosting your stats. I also created 3 different layouts in the D4 build planner in the description below. One for survivability to easily clear tier 8 Infernal Hoards, one for damage dealing for pushing the highest tier pits, and one with no Uber uniques. And these different builds will have different gear and skills on the skill tree. Okay, so next for the Paragon Board, and this is a fully optimized Paragon Board at level 100 for this build. And with this Paragon Board, I did take 8 glyphs to maximize my damage and survivability. Now I'm just going to quickly go over the Paragon Board, going over the important nodes and glyphs, but I'll have the full Paragon Board layout in a D4 build planner in the description below. So starting with the starter board, I'm using the Elementalist glyph, and the additional bonus states dealing fire, cold, or lightning damage to an enemy increases all damage you deal to them by 5% for 10 seconds, stacking once per element. And with this build, you can easily max out this bonus because we can easily deal fire, cold, and lightning damage. The next Paragon Board I'm using is Frigid Fate, and the glyph I'm using is Unleash. And the additional bonus states after spending 50 mana, you deal 8% increased damage and gain 25% increased mana regeneration for 3 seconds. Now this glyph is really strong to greatly increase your damage and mana regeneration. I also took the legendary node Frigid Fate, which states you deal bonus damage to vulnerable enemies equal to 20% of the total amount of bonus damage with cold, up to a maximum of 60%. Now even though we're not focusing on building cold damage, this build does have a lot of non-physical damage, which is considered cold damage as well. So we can easily cap out this legendary node. As you can see, my current bonus is at 60%. You also want to take these rare nodes Oppressive and Guarded to gain damage reduction from vulnerable enemies to greatly increase your survivability. Now I did split this Paragon Board into 2 directions, so first heading up this way. The next Paragon Board I took is Elemental Summoner, and the glyph I'm using is Conjurer. And the additional bonus states conjuration skills have 20% increased duration. So this glyph will increase the duration of our conjuration skills, allowing us to have tons of conjurations on the field, which will pair really well with the Fractured Winterglass unique amulet to greatly increase our damage. I also took the legendary node Elemental Summoner, which states your conjuration skills have a 10% reduced cooldown or mana cost. They also deal bonus damage equal to 10% of the total amount of bonus damage with fire, lightning, and cold up to 60%. And this legendary node is really good to reduce the cooldown of our conjuration skills. Then heading back to the Frigid Fate Paragon Board, and then heading right this way. The next Paragon Board I took is Burning Instinct, and the glyph I'm using is Tactician. And the additional bonus states you deal 10% increased damage for 4 seconds after casting a defensive skill. This duration is increased by 4 seconds for each defensive skill not on your action bar. So this glyph will greatly increase your damage after using a defensive skill. You also want to take this rare node Smoldering Embers to gain damage reduction from burning enemies, and this rare node Safeguard to gain damage reduction from elites. And these rare nodes will greatly increase your survivability. Then heading up this way, and the next Paragon Board I took is Enchantment Master, and the glyph I'm using is Destruction. And additional bonus states critical strikes increase all damage the enemy takes from you by 2% for 10 seconds, up to 12%. So this glyph will greatly increase your damage when you critically strike an enemy. And you want to take these rare nodes Elemental Balance and Ruinous to greatly increase your non-physical damage. Then heading right this way, and the next Paragon Board I took is Ceaseless Conduit, and the glyph I'm using is Territorial. And additional bonus states you gain 15% damage reduction against close enemies. And this glyph is really good for defense and survivability. Then heading down this way, and the next Paragon board I took is Searing Heat, and the glyph I'm using is Control. An additional bonus states you deal 10% increased damage to slowed or chilled enemies, or instead 20% increased damage to stunned or frozen enemies. And this glyph will greatly increase your damage to chilled or frozen enemies, or when bosses are staggered. Then heading left this way, and the last Paragon board I'm using is Icefall, and the glyph I'm using is Exploit. An additional bonus states dealing damage to a vulnerable enemy increases your damage by 1% for 6 seconds up to 10%. So this glyph will greatly increase your damage when you deal damage to vulnerable enemies. Okay, so that's a fully optimized Paragon board at level 100 for this build, and you want to get your glyphs to at least level 15 plus to be able to get the additional bonus. And like I mentioned before, I'll have this full Paragon board layout in a D4 build planner in the description below. Okay, so thanks for checking out one of the best, strongest, and fastest Lightning Spear Sorcerer build in Season 5. With this build, you can easily clear Tier 8 Infernal Hoards and melt Uber Lilith. This build does tons of damage and can destroy any Uber bosses in seconds. And in the D4 build planner in the description below, I'll share 3 different build layouts depending on your situation. A survivability build for easily clearing Tier 8 Infernal Hoards, a damage focused build for clearing the highest tier pits, and a build without any Uber uniques. Hope this helps, and more Diablo 4 videos to come, so stay tuned. And of course,